Why did a licensed American psychiatrist come to believe that a single molecule inside your brain might be responsible for thousands of alien abduction reports? This is the story of DMT, the chemical some scientists nicknamed the spirit molecule, and the strange government-approved study that tried to answer one of the most unusual questions in modern science. For most of its history, DMT was known only inside small circles of chemists and anthropologists. Today, it is one of the most talked about psychedelics on the internet, famous for producing what users describe as full, immersive encounters with intelligent beings, sometimes within a single minute of inhaling it. But long before it became an online obsession, DMT had already forced serious researchers to ask an uncomfortable question, one that came out of a fully funded, peer-reviewed research program rather than internet forums or late-night talk shows. What if some alien encounters were never about aliens at all, and were instead the product of a hallucinogen the human body may already be capable of making on its own? DMT, short for N,N-dimethyltryptamine, was first synthesized in a laboratory in 1931 by the Canadian chemist Richard Mansky. At the time, nobody understood what the compound could do to the human mind. It sat quietly in scientific journals as little more than a chemical curiosity. 15 years later, in 1946, a Brazilian microbiologist named Oswaldo Goncalves de Lima identified a related compound while studying a fermented drink used by the Pancararu people of northeastern Brazil, a drink made from the bark of a tree now known as Mimosa tenuiflora. That discovery hinted that this strange molecule already existed somewhere in nature, long before Western science had a name for it. The real turning point came in 1956. A Hungarian chemist and psychiatrist named Stephen Zara wanted to study psychedelic compounds, but the company that made LSD refused to send samples behind the Iron Curtain. So Zara synthesized his own alternative. He extracted DMT and injected it into himself and later into a group of volunteer physicians. Zara documented vivid visual hallucinations, distorted perception of space, and intense euphoria, all within minutes of injection and fading within an hour. For the first time, science had proof that this compound could completely alter human consciousness, and it could do it faster than almost anything else known at the time. What made DMT stand apart from LSD or psilocybin was not just its speed, it was where it came from. Researchers later confirmed that DMT occurs naturally in many plants across South America, where it forms the psychoactive backbone of ayahuasca, a brew used for centuries in Amazonian shamanic ceremonies. Indigenous communities across the Amazon basin had been combining DMT containing plants with a second plant containing natural monoamine oxidase inhibitors long before Western chemists had a name for either ingredient, allowing the DMT to survive digestion and produce hours-long ceremonial visions instead of the brief, intense effect seen with injection. Long before laboratories existed, these communities had already discovered, through generations of trial and observation, exactly the chemistry that 20th century scientists would spend decades trying to explain. But DMT was not only found in plants. Scientists eventually detected trace amounts of DMT in mammals, including in the human body itself. That single fact turned a plant compound into something far stranger, an endogenous hallucinogen, a substance the human brain appeared capable of producing on its own. By the 1960s and 70s, DMT had drifted into counterculture circles alongside LSD and mescaline, but it never reached the same mainstream fame. That began to change decades later thanks to the writer and ethnobotanist Terence McKenna, who described his own DMT experiences in vivid public lectures. McKenna spoke of entering a space filled with what he called self-transforming machine elves, playful, hyper-intelligent entities that seemed to communicate through language made of pure color and geometry, offering gifts, performing acrobatics, and inviting him to join in a kind of cosmic celebration. He described the sensation as being unmistakably real, more solid and more convincing than ordinary waking life, not something that felt like a dream or a trick of the mind. McKenna was not a clinical scientist, and his claims were never tested in a laboratory, but his descriptions spread widely through lectures, recordings, and eventually the early internet, and they set the stage for a question that actual researchers would soon try to answer scientifically. Why did so many people, independently, describe meeting something that felt intelligent, aware, and completely real, using strikingly similar language, despite having no way of comparing notes beforehand? please comment below where you are watching this from and stay with us, because the science gets even stranger from here. That question eventually reached Dr. Rick Strassman, a clinical psychiatrist at the University of New Mexico. In 1990, after years of navigating regulatory approval, Strassman received permission from the United States government to conduct the first legal human research on a classic psychedelic in over 2 decades. Between 1990 and 1995, Strassman injected 60 volunteers with pure DMT under controlled clinical conditions, carefully documenting everything they experienced. Strassman expected his subjects to report classic mystical or spiritual experiences similar to what had been documented with other psychedelics. What he did not expect was how often his volunteers described the same specific type of event. A striking number of them reported being pulled suddenly into another realm and encountering conscious, intelligent, non-human beings. Volunteers described clinical-looking rooms, structures resembling laboratories or examination spaces, and entities that seemed curious, communicative, and sometimes strangely bureaucratic in their behavior. Many volunteers used one word, unprompted, to describe what they had encountered: aliens. To understand why that word carried so much weight in 1990, it helps to know what American culture already believed about alien encounters by that point. The modern alien abduction narrative traces back to 1961, when a New Hampshire couple named Betty and Barney Hill reported being taken aboard a craft and examined by non-human beings, an account that became the basis for the 1966 bestseller, The Interrupted Journey. 2 decades later, in 1987, the same year Strassman was still finishing the paperwork to begin his research, author Whitley Strieber published Communion, a memoir describing his own alleged abduction and examination by beings he could not explain. The same year, investigator Bud Hopkins released Intruders, his second book documenting similar reports gathered from dozens of people under hypnosis. Together, these books turned alien abduction from a fringe curiosity into a defining piece of American pop culture, complete with a widely recognized description of the beings involved: small, large-eyed, gray-skinned figures who examined their subjects in clinical, almost medical environments. Strassman was struck by how closely his volunteers' accounts resembled that specific cultural script. Abduction accounts often describe being taken against one's will into sterile, high-tech environments, encountering beings who examined or communicated with the person, and then returning to ordinary reality with a profound sense that something real had occurred, even though there was no physical evidence to support it. Strassman noticed that his DMT volunteers, sober, consenting adults in a hospital research room with no history of alien encounters, were describing an almost identical structure of experience, despite lying on a hospital bed the entire time with medical staff watching over them. This led Strassman to a bold hypothesis, one he would later lay out in his 1999 book DMT, the spirit molecule. He proposed that the human pineal gland, a small structure deep in the brain that regulates the sleep hormone melatonin, might also be capable of producing DMT naturally, and that it could release it during extreme moments of life, including birth, death, deep meditation, and dreaming. Strassman theorized that at least some reported alien abduction experiences might actually be spontaneous, uncontrolled releases of endogenous DMT, triggering the brain into an involuntary version of exactly what his research volunteers experienced intentionally in a laboratory setting. In other words, the abduction might not be happening in the sky. It might be happening inside the person's own skull. The idea was electrifying because it offered something rare, a physical, biological explanation for an experience that usually sat entirely outside the reach of science. It did not require little green men or secret government cover-ups. It only required a molecule the body might already be capable of making. But an idea being compelling is not the same as an idea being proven, and this is where the science gets genuinely contested. Strassman's pineal gland theory faced serious pushback from other researchers in the field. In 2018, pharmacologist David Nichols published a widely cited paper arguing that the human pineal gland is simply too small, and its known chemical pathways too limited to produce anywhere near the amount of DMT that would be required to trigger a full-blown psychedelic experience during birth or death. According to Nichols, the biochemistry needed to manufacture psychoactive quantities of DMT in mere seconds, exactly when Strassman proposed it would happen, does not appear to exist in the human body as currently understood. Other scientists, including toxicologist Stephen Barker, pushed back against Nichols in turn, pointing to studies detecting DMT and its related enzymes in human and animal tissue, including a notable 2019 study that found DMT levels roughly doubling in the visual cortex of rats after cardiac arrest was induced, regardless of whether the pineal gland was intact. That finding suggested the brain may have more than one way of producing DMT, keeping the door open to Strassman's broader theory even as his original pineal gland mechanism remained unconfirmed. Barker and Nichols eventually published dueling replies to each other in the same academic journal in 2018, each standing firmly by their own reading of the evidence, a public disagreement that captured just how unsettled this corner of neuroscience really is. As of today, no study has definitively detected DMT in the human brain at levels high enough to independently trigger the kind of experience Strassman's volunteers had under direct injection. The debate remains open, and researchers on both sides continue publishing competing evidence. Meanwhile, the entity encounters themselves kept demanding scientific attention, regardless of what was or was not happening in the pineal gland. In 2018, researchers at Imperial College London, including Dr. Chris Timmerman, published a study directly comparing DMT experiences to near-death experiences, finding striking overlaps in themes like leaving the body, encountering a bright light or presence, and a profound loss of the fear of death. Then in 2020, researchers from Johns Hopkins University surveyed over 2,500 people who reported encountering a being while using inhaled DMT. Lead researcher Alan Davis and his team specifically asked participants to describe the being's appearance, behavior, and the feelings it seemed to convey, treating the reports with the same seriousness typically reserved for any other subjective clinical outcome. The results, published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, found something researchers did not fully anticipate. The vast majority of these entity encounters were described as benevolent. Respondents most often characterized the beings as caring, intelligent, and even loving, with many describing lasting positive changes to their beliefs about reality long after the experience ended. This created an interesting shift in how scientists began framing the phenomenon. The question was no longer simply whether DMT could explain alien encounters. It became a broader question about why the human brain, under this specific chemical, so reliably constructs the experience of meeting another mind. Some researchers point to how DMT dramatically increases connectivity across different brain regions, based on brain imaging studies conducted at Imperial College London, essentially loosening the normal boundaries the brain uses to model reality. Under that theory, the entities are not proof of contact with an outside intelligence, alien or otherwise. They may instead be the brain's own model-making machinery, the same system that fills in gaps in ordinary vision and perception, running without its usual constraints and generating the powerful, undeniable sensation of encountering someone real. That explanation does not fully satisfy everyone, including some of the researchers closest to the data. The overwhelming consistency of these reports, across cultures, backgrounds, and decades, unsettles the idea that this is simple, random hallucination. Strangers with no contact with each other, no shared cultural script, and often no prior interest in psychedelics or aliens, keep independently describing remarkably similar rooms, similar beings, and similar sensations of being observed, tested, or welcomed. Whether that consistency comes from a shared feature of human neurology, an unexplained biological function of DMT, or something science has not yet identified, remains genuinely unresolved. Today, DMT research has entered a new, more rigorous phase. Teams including those at Imperial College London have begun conducting extended-state DMT studies, using slow, continuous intravenous infusion pioneered by researcher Andrew Gallimore and Dr. Strassman himself to keep volunteers inside the DMT experience for much longer than the usual 10 to 20-minute peak, allowing scientists to study these entity encounters in far more methodical detail than was ever possible before. Early results from small groups of volunteers suggest people are able to remain lucid and communicative for extended periods while still describing the same core encounters, giving researchers an unprecedented window into whatever is actually happening during these events. Some scientists involved in this research have even suggested that longer exposure could eventually allow something resembling sustained two-way communication with whatever the mind is constructing, turning a question that once belonged entirely to ufologists and mystics into a live, ongoing laboratory experiment. So did science ever prove that DMT explains alien encounters? Not exactly. Strassman's own theory about the pineal gland remains unproven, and mainstream researchers today are generally cautious about drawing a straight line between a hospital drug trial and decades of separate abduction reports collected under very different conditions, often involving hypnosis, sleep disturbances, and cultural expectations that DMT volunteers simply did not share. What science did prove is something almost as strange. A molecule already present in trace amounts inside the human body, when introduced in higher doses, reliably produces one of the most specific, detailed, and personally transformative experiences known to psychology, one that keeps overlapping again and again with humanity's most persistent stories about meeting something not of this world. Whether that overlap comes from a shared biological blueprint buried in the human brain, pure coincidence, or something science has not yet found the language to describe, the question that started with a handful of volunteers in a New Mexico hospital room in the early 1990s is still very much alive today, and it is still being tested, one careful infusion at a time.